alluded to before is that there's very few chemotherapy drugs that aren't, or I should say, treatment for cancers that aren't targeted to specific cancer types. Do they work across all different fields? No. Everyone remembers Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, has skin cancer, malignant melanoma, not multiple myeloma, but melanoma. He had brain metastases. He got a drug that the drug class is called PD-1 inhibitors. Cleared up his, this is like 2-3 years ago already. He's been in remission 2-3 years from a drug that went through a clinical trial. So these PD-1 inhibitors work fantastic, at least for him. He's obviously still alive and functioning. But let's say, do those drugs work in myeloma? So we took the way PD-1 drugs work, this new class, brand new class of drugs, is if anyone's here are Star Trek or Star Wars fans, when the spaceships are flying around and they're being chased, they're shooting these photon beams at each other, they always go, shields are down to 63%. So tumor cells have shields on the outside of them, shields to protect them, just like in Star Wars and Star Trek, that they got to break through the shields, you can't destroy the ship. So tumor cells have shields around them, and these PD-1 inhibitors are photon beams that can punch holes into the shields, so then that the drugs can work. And that's the way this class of drug works. So does that work in myeloma? And the answer is, after doing very extensive trials, including these phase 3 trials, it didn't work. It just didn't work in myeloma. Don't ask me why, I don't know why. It just doesn't work in myeloma. It works in a whole variety of solid tumors. It works in a whole variety of lymphomas. In myeloma, it was a bust. So you can take a drug that's already approved. So some of the clinical trials are taking drugs for one disease, trying another disease. So these photon beam drugs that poke holes in the shields work great with some cancers, both blood cancers and solid tumors. Myeloma is not going anywhere. So everything doesn't work for all diseases. But sometimes you go like, okay, let's take that drug, even though it didn't work by itself, and combine it with a drug that does work. More clinical trials. So we take the photon beam drug, we add it to another drug, maybe it'll work better that way. Actually, in myeloma, they did that with that particular drug, still didn't. So these concepts of doing this is really important. We have people here in this audience who don't have myeloma. Most of them don't have myeloma. And some of these concepts of doing clinical trials is true across the board. There are ways to look for you to find out if you're eligible, or at least if there's clinical trials. So we had the one young lady who has stage 4 lung cancer. You can go to a website. There may be lung cancer websites, but there's a government sponsored website. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov, open to anybody. You open the page, you go to the URL, you type in stage 4 lung cancer, and you'll get God knows how many listings of clinical trials. The problem with doing that is you may come up with 100 clinical trials. Some of them may be in Canada, they may be in Russia, and you may not be eligible for them. So even though we're all promoting this idea of clinical trials, you may not be eligible for it, or it may not be anywhere close to you. But there are ways to find out, or if you have the wherewithal, maybe you could go. In the MMRF, they have actually, would you like to come here and say what you have for the myeloma patients? I don't want to misspeak.
Okay, so we have a couple of things. We have our own clinical trial finder on our website. So, and that will only give you trials for myeloma patients. And you can then filter the results. You can tell the clinical trial finder, I only want to find trials that are within, 50 miles of my zip code, or 100 miles of my zip code. Or I only want a clinical trial for a patient who's newly diagnosed with myeloma versus a patient who has already had one course of therapy and then has now relapsed from myeloma. So you can filter the results more easily on the clinical trial finder on our website than what you can do on clinicaltrials.gov, although you can filter on there too. Their filter is actually pretty good, but it's harder to use. But really the best way is for you to get on the phone and call our nurses at our patient support center and just tell them your story. Tell them your disease, tell them what you want, and they can help find information for you and point you in the direction of a clinical trial that might be appropriate. Then you can take that information to your doctor and say, hey, I found out about this. What do you think? Do you think I should do it? And that's really the way, probably the easiest way to do it.
Thank you, Barry. So the MMRF is not the only one. For those that have other diseases besides myeloma, the American Cancer Society has a mechanism to do this. And you can either call them just like you can for the MMRF. There's other myeloma organizations and lymphoma organizations. The Leukemia Lymphoma Society has a mechanism to look at clinical trials. The International Myeloma Foundation has a way to look for clinical trials. There's a number of search engines to look for clinical trials and where they are. I obviously promoting this, and that's one of the purposes of this section of the presentation, but the problem still arises. I talked briefly about CAR T cells, taking your own cells, make them angry, shoot missiles. Well, we participate in that, but that being said, it takes almost literally an act of God to get someone on that protocol. They have to be in the right place at the right time, and it's very difficult to get people on this very, very exciting therapy because there's not very many slots available, and you have to have a specific profile to get on that. So clinical trials are not always easy to get on. Even if you say, oh, wow, I want to help myself and help other people, doesn't mean you necessarily get on one of them because there's limitations sometimes in the number of people that can get on them. So this is important for advancing any kind of disease. This clinicaltrials.gov is not restricted just to cancers. If you say, oh, I've got bad blood pressure and the doctors can't figure it out, maybe I should go on a clinical trial, some new drug. You can go on the same website, clinicaltrials.gov, and get information about clinical trials for blood pressure problems. It's true, it's across the board. Essentially all registered clinical trials in the US and many outside the US are on this website that you can look things up. So just a piece of information for you, and I think with that I'm going to stop. Thank you.
We'll get ready for questions and answers, but I want to say two things. One thing that hasn't come up, what are the benefits, not just about the disease, but you see your doctor and your healthcare providers more often, you have more attention paid to you when you participate in a clinical trial. Not that your doctors neglect you otherwise, but because of the rigorous routine and protocol and time designs when you have to come back and be re-examined, you get a lot of extra care and attention. So that's one benefit. And as Dr. VESOLE talked about phase 1 trials, you might think, why would I ever participate in a study where we don't know how safe it is? And many people do that because they might have tried all other treatments. They might have advanced cancer, and there are no other alternatives. So that's why people do phase 1, those studies. But the other studies that you would generally be involved in are phase 3. They've been tested and regulated by FDA. So